February 9th, 1964. 73 million Americans, over one-third of the entire U.S. population, are watching the same thing. The Ed Sullivan Show. Four young men from Liverpool step onto the stage. Shaggy hair, skinny suits, matching boots. They start playing, and in 12 minutes, they detonate a cultural bomb that will reshape the entire world. The Beatles aren't just a band. They're a revolution disguised as pop music. Within 6 years, they will transform music from simple entertainment into art. They'll make the album more important than the single. They'll prove musicians can write their own songs, control their own careers, say whatever they want. They'll challenge war, religion, politics, social norms. They'll introduce Eastern philosophy to the West. They'll make drugs mainstream. They'll turn youth culture into the dominant culture. They'll change fashion, language, technology, consciousness itself. But here's the real question. How did four working-class kids with no formal training become the most influential musicians in human history? How did they change not just music, but the entire way society thinks, acts, and sees itself? This is that story. Liverpool, England, 1950s. A port city bombed to rubble during World War II. Working class, rough, going nowhere. John Lennon grows up angry. His father abandoned him. His mother gave him to his aunt. He uses humor and rebellion to hide the pain. He's smart but hates authority. Gets kicked out of schools. Forms a band called the Quarrymen, playing skiffle, a cheap British version of American rock and roll. July 6th, 1957. A church garden party. John's band is playing. A 15-year-old kid named Paul McCartney shows up. Someone introduces them. Paul picks up a guitar and plays Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock perfectly, knows all the words. Can tune a guitar, something John can't do. John is impressed but threatened. Paul is younger, better looking, more talented, but John invites him to join anyway. That decision changes history. Paul brings in his friend George Harrison. George is even younger, only 14, but he can play guitar better than anyone. John, Paul, George. The core is formed. They play everywhere. Basement clubs, school dances, anywhere that will have them. They're decent but not special. Just another band playing American rock covers. They need a drummer for a gig in Hamburg, Germany. They find Pete Best. Now they're four. They call themselves the Beatles, a stupid pun on beat music and Buddy Holly's crickets. Hamburg changes everything. They're booked to play in the Kaiserkeller, a rough club in the red light district. The contract says they must play 8 hours a night. 8 hours, night after night, week after week. It's brutal. They take stimulants to stay awake, drink to cope, play through exhaustion. But something happens. They get incredibly tight. They learn to entertain drunk sailors and gangsters. They develop stage presence, energy, danger. John starts wearing a toilet seat around his neck on stage. They insult the audience in broken German. They jump around. They're not just playing music, they're performing. They're creating a show. When they return to Liverpool in 1961, they're different, tighter, louder, more confident. They start packing out a basement club called The Cavern. Lines around the block. Kids going absolutely crazy for them. November 9th, 1961. A local record store owner named Brian Epstein goes to The Cavern to see what the fuss is about. He watches these four guys in leather jackets playing raw rock and roll. The crowd is screaming. Girls are crying. Brian sees something, not just a band, a phenomenon. He approaches them after the show and says he wants to manage them. They say yes. Brian cleans them up, gets rid of the leather jackets, puts them in matching suits, makes them bow after songs, teaches them professionalism. The Beatles hated it first, John especially. But Brian promises he'll get them a record deal, so they play along. Brian takes them to every record label in London. Everyone rejects them. Decca Records famously says, "Guitar groups are on their way out, Mr. Epstein." Finally, a producer named George Martin at Parlophone Records agrees to a session. George Martin is classically trained, produces comedy records and classical music. He doesn't like rock and roll, but he sees something in these four kids. June 1962. First recording session. George Martin immediately spots a problem. Pete Best can't keep time. He tells Brian, the drummer has to go. August 1962. The Beatles fire Pete Best and bring in Ringo Starr, a drummer from another Liverpool band. Ringo is solid, reliable, and has a unique style. The final piece clicks into place. John, Paul, George, Ringo. The Beatles as the world will know them. October 5th, 1962. Love Me Do is released. It reaches number 17 in the UK charts. Modest, but it's a start. January 1963. Please Please Me hits number 1. Suddenly, the Beatles are famous in England. But here's what makes them different from every other pop group. They write their own songs. This seems normal now, but in 1963, it's revolutionary. Pop stars don't write. Professional songwriters in offices write hits, and pretty faces sing them. That's how it works. But John and Paul write together. They write dozens of songs. Good songs, great songs. They don't need anyone else. This changes the power dynamic. Suddenly, musicians aren't just performers. They're creators. They control their own material. They can't be replaced. Throughout 1963, Beatlemania explodes in Britain. Every single they release hits number 1. Girls scream so loud at concerts that the band can't hear themselves play. Police struggle to control crowds. It's hysteria, mass hysteria, but America doesn't care. Capitol Records, the Beatles' U.S. distributor, refuses to release their music. They think the Beatles are just another British fad that won't translate. Brian Epstein doesn't give up. He books the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, the biggest TV show in America. He guarantees they'll be number 1 in the U.S. before they appear. Capitol finally agrees to release I Want to Hold Your Hand in December 1963. Radio stations start playing it, kids start requesting it, and suddenly, impossibly, it starts climbing the charts. January 1964. I Want to Hold Your Hand hits number 1 in America. Brian's prediction comes true. February 9th, 1964. The Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million people watching. The largest audience in television history up to that point. The Beatles perform 5 songs. Girls in the audience are crying, screaming, fainting. The camera cuts to their faces. Pure ecstasy. This isn't about music anymore. This is something primal, religious, revolutionary. Middle America watches in horror. These boys have long hair. They're shaking their heads. They're making our daughters scream. This is the end of civilization. But the kids see something else. They see freedom, rebellion, fun, joy. 4 guys their own age who don't follow the rules, who have long hair when men are supposed to have crew cuts, who talk back, who joke around, who aren't afraid of authority. The Beatles become the symbol of youth culture, breaking free from the conservative 1950s. They're the soundtrack of the 1960s before the 60s even really begin. Within weeks, Beatlemania conquers America completely. They have the top 5 songs on the Billboard Hot 100 simultaneously, something that has never happened before and never will again. They have 12 songs in the Hot 100 at once. 12. Every aspect of American culture shifts. Boys grow their hair long. Fashion changes overnight. The Beatles cut becomes standard. Collarless suits, Cuban-heeled boots. Everything they wear becomes a trend. But here's what's really revolutionary. The Beatles make it okay for boys to be soft, to sing about love and feelings, to hold hands, to be vulnerable. Before the Beatles, male rock stars are like Elvis, dangerous, sexual, threatening. The Beatles are safe enough for parents, but exciting enough for kids. They're not trying to steal your daughter. They just want to hold her hand. This opens rock and roll to a massive mainstream audience. Parents buy Beatles records for their kids. The Beatles appear on lunchboxes, dolls, wigs, everything. They're a merchandising phenomenon. But while they're being sold as cute mop tops, something else is happening. They're learning, growing, evolving. In 1964, they meet Bob Dylan. Dylan introduces them to marijuana and serious lyrics. He asks them, "Don't you write songs about anything?" This question changes everything. John and Paul start writing deeper lyrics, not just yeah, yeah, yeah anymore. Real thoughts, real feelings. Help! The title track is John crying for help, admitting vulnerability. Yesterday is Paul writing the most covered song in history, a melancholic reflection on loss. They start experimenting in the studio. George Martin becomes their collaborator, not just their producer. They use the recording studio as an instrument. They try things nobody has tried. Rubber Soul comes out in December 1965. It's not just a collection of singles, it's a coherent album. Every song flows into the next. It's art, not just entertainment. Critics who dismiss them as a teen fad start paying attention. This is sophisticated. This is serious. These aren't just four lucky kids. These are artists. August 1966. The Beatles play their last concert ever at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. They're the biggest band in the world. They could tour forever, make infinite money. They decide to stop. Never tour again. Why? Because nobody can hear them. The screaming is so loud they can't hear themselves play. They're not making music anymore. They're just standing there while girls scream. John says, "We're not going to be like Elvis, playing Vegas when we're 40. We're going to stop while we're still good." They retreat to the recording studio. And this is where everything changes. Without the pressure of performing live, the Beatles start treating the studio as a laboratory. They have unlimited time, unlimited budget. George Martin willing to try anything. February 1967, they release Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane as a double A-side single. Both songs are unlike anything in pop music. Backward tapes, orchestras, multiple tempos spliced together. Lyrics about childhood memories, not love. John's voice on Strawberry Fields sounds like he's singing from another dimension. Nothing is real. It's psychedelic. It's art. It's revolutionary. June 1st, 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is released. It changes music forever. It's not a collection of singles, it's a concept album, a complete artistic statement. The songs flow together. The album cover is art. The Beatles in colorful military uniforms surrounded by dozens of cultural icons. It cost more to make than any album cover in history. The music is insane. Orchestra crescendos, Indian sitars, lyrics about LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, circuses, aging, everyday life elevated to poetry. The final track, A Day in the Life, is 7 minutes of orchestral chaos, ending with one of the most famous chords in music history. John singing about reading the news like it's existential horror. Paul singing about mundane routine. An orchestra rising to apocalyptic climax. Critics lose their minds. The Times of London calls it a decisive moment in the history of Western civilization. Not just music history, human civilization. Sgt. Pepper's legitimizes rock music as art. Before Sgt. Pepper's, rock is entertainment for kids. After Sgt. Pepper's, rock is taken seriously by intellectuals, academics, cultural critics. It can be analyzed, discussed, studied. But the Beatles aren't done. They're evolving faster than anyone can keep up with. August 1967, Brian Epstein dies of an accidental overdose. The Beatles lose their manager, their anchor, their connection to the business world. They're devastated, but they continue. They decide to manage themselves. They start Apple Corps, a multimedia corporation. The idea, creative freedom for artists without corporate control. It's naive and idealistic, and mostly fails, but the intention is revolutionary. They travel to India to study meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They bring transcendental meditation and Eastern philosophy to millions of Western kids. Suddenly, yoga and meditation aren't weird foreign practices. They're cool because the Beatles do them. While in India, they write dozens of songs. They return and record the White Album, 30 songs, every style imaginable. Hard rock, ballads, avant-garde sound collages, country, blues. It's all over the place, and that's the point. They're showing their range, proving they can do anything. But cracks are forming. Paul wants to work constantly. John is falling in love with Yoko Ono and becoming more experimental. George is tired of being the quiet Beatle and wants more songs on albums. Ringo briefly quits during White Album sessions. They're growing apart, but they still have magic left. January 1969. The Get Back sessions. The idea, strip away all the studio tricks and just play rock and roll like they used to. It's a disaster. They argue constantly. The footage shows 4 people who don't want to be in the same room. But then something beautiful happens. January 30th, 1969. They set up on the roof of Apple headquarters in London and play an unannounced concert. Their first live performance in 3 years. They play for 42 minutes until police shut them down. Office workers pour into the streets. Traffic stops. Everyone looking up at four guys on a roof playing rock and roll. It's spontaneous, joyful, pure. The rooftop concert becomes legendary. Their final live performance, a perfect ending. Except it's not the end. They have one more album in them, summer 1969. They record Abbey Road. They know it's probably their last album together. They pour everything into it. Side 2 of Abbey Road is a 16-minute medley of songs flowing into each other. It's a suite. Classical music structure applied to rock. Paul's The End contains the lyric, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make." It's their final statement. After all the experimentation, all the pushing boundaries, all the revolution, they end with a simple truth about love. Abbey Road is released in September 1969. The cover is four guys walking across the street. That's it. It becomes the most iconic album cover ever. April 10th, 1970. Paul announces he's leaving the Beatles. The most successful band in history breaks up at their peak. They're done. In 8 years of recording, they released 13 albums, over 200 songs. They sold hundreds of millions of records, changed music forever, changed culture forever, changed consciousness forever. The Beatles have been broken up for over 50 years, longer than they were together, but their influence grows stronger every year. Every band that writes their own songs, that's the Beatles' legacy. Every concept album, that's Sgt. Pepper's. Every music video, that's the Beatles inventing the form with their films. Every rock band taking themselves seriously as artists, that's the Beatles proving it's possible. Think about what they normalized. Musicians writing their own material. Albums as artistic statements, not just collections of singles. Studio experimentation, Eastern philosophy and Western pop culture. Anti-war messages in mainstream music. Long hair on men. Youth culture as the dominant culture. Before the Beatles, rock and roll is dangerous music parents fear. After the Beatles, rock is the soundtrack of society. It's everywhere. It's mainstream. It's art. It's rebellion. It's commerce. It's everything. The Beatles proved musicians could be more than entertainers. They could be cultural leaders, philosophers, voices of a generation. When John Lennon said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, he caused a massive controversy. But he wasn't entirely wrong. For millions of young people in the 1960s, the Beatles were more influential than religion. They shaped values, beliefs, behaviors more than any church. After the breakup, all four Beatles had solo careers. John released Imagine, one of the most influential songs ever written, a vision of peace and unity that's still played at every major global event. Paul formed Wings, had more #1 hits than any other artist in history. He's still touring at over 80 years old. George became a solo artist and spiritual seeker. His My Sweet Lord was the first solo Beatles #1. Ringo had hit singles and became everyone's favorite Beatle through his warm personality. But the story turned tragic. December 8th, 1980. John Lennon is shot and killed by a deranged fan outside his apartment in New York. He's 40 years old. The world mourns like a head of state died. November 29th, 2001. George Harrison dies of cancer at 58. Two Beatles gone too soon. Paul and Ringo continue carrying the legacy. They perform Beatles songs to massive crowds. Generations of people who weren't born when the Beatles broke up know every word. In 1995-96, the remaining Beatles reunited to finish 2 John Lennon demos using modern technology. Free as a Bird and Real Love give fans closure. In 2023, they released Now and Then, the final Beatles song, using AI to extract John's voice from an old demo. It's beautiful and bittersweet, the last new Beatles song ever. The Beatles are everywhere. In 2000, they released One, a greatest hits album. It sold 31 million copies. In 2000, decades after they broke up, they're the best-selling band in history, over 600 million records sold. They have more #1 albums than any artist. More number one hits than anyone except maybe Elvis. But the numbers don't capture the real impact. The Beatles change how humanity thinks about youth, rebellion, creativity, consciousness. They proved you could be commercially successful and artistically credible. You could sell millions of records and still be taken seriously as an artist. Before the Beatles, those were mutually exclusive. They showed that pop music could tackle serious subjects: war, death, loneliness, consciousness, spirituality, not just love and dancing. Every rock documentary, every music biopic, every artist talking about their creative process. That's the Beatles establishing the template. They made the making of music as interesting as the music itself. The studio techniques they invented are still used today. Automatic double tracking, Verispeed recording, direct input recording, reverse tape effects. They didn't invent all of these, but they popularized them and proved they could be used in pop music. Their influence goes beyond music. The Beatles changed fashion, language, attitudes, social norms. They made it okay to question authority, to experiment with consciousness, to seek meaning beyond material success. When the Beatles said they used drugs, millions of young people tried drugs. When they meditated, millions meditated. When they opposed the Vietnam War, millions opposed it. They had that kind of cultural power. Film directors cite Beatles films as influences. Quentin Tarantino, Edgar Wright, Wes Anderson. The Beatles movies A Hard Day's Night and Help invented the modern music video aesthetic. Video games. The Beatles, Rock Band, was a massive success, introduced new generations to their music. Every boy band that followed, from the Monkees to One Direction, exists because the Beatles proved the concept could work. But the Beatles transcend being a boy band. They evolved past teen idol status into serious artists. That evolution, that growth in public, that's the template every artist follows now. Artists today still cite the Beatles as their biggest influence. Kanye West, Radiohead, Oasis, Arctic Monkeys, Taylor Swift, everyone, across every genre. Hip-hop producers sample Beatles songs. Electronic artists remix them. Country singers cover them. Yesterday is the most covered song in history, over 2,200 versions. It's been played more than 7 million times on US radio alone. The Beatles proved that music from a specific time and place could be universal and timeless. Their songs don't sound dated. They sound classic, eternal. 60 years after they first appeared on Ed Sullivan, teenagers are still discovering the Beatles and having their minds blown. Still learning every word to Hey Jude, still crying to Let It Be, still tripping out to Tomorrow Never Knows. The Beatles aren't just music history, they're living culture, constantly rediscovered, constantly relevant, constantly influencing new artists who influence other artists. So how did the Beatles change the world? They transformed music from entertainment into art. They proved musicians could write their own songs, control their careers, and be taken seriously as cultural leaders. They made the album more important than the single. They introduced the recording studio as an instrument. They broke down barriers between high and low culture, between commerce and art, between East and West, between parent and youth culture. They showed that you could be massively successful and artistically credible, that you could evolve in public and bring millions along with you, that you could question everything and still create joy. 4 working-class kids from Liverpool with no formal training became the most influential musicians in history. They changed how music is made, how it's consumed, how it's understood. They changed fashion, language, attitudes toward authority, consciousness itself. The Beatles didn't just change culture, they became culture. And 60 years later, they still are.